The term was probably first used in Kenya. It was Clark University and Egerton University were working together in Machakos, a part of Kenya. And they called what they were doing PRA, Participatory Rural Appraisal. I think that's probably where the term was first used. But what they did was a quite different tradition, and it went on being called PRA, but it was actually a very systematic form of community planning. And in Kenya, there were almost two schools of PRA. There was the Egerton one, which was this rather formal. They did 3 weeks training, most of it in the classroom. And then there was the PRA tradition, which was much more innovative, much looser, much more creative, I would say. And these two went their separate ways, and still, I think, are going their separate ways. So that was happening there in terms of the name, but in terms of the way in which it developed really creatively, that happened in India, to the best of my knowledge. But you have to say that these things tend to have their time when they start emerging around the world. And it's very easy to say, this was the stream, you know? But actually, there may have been other ones. You take participatory mapping, okay? Take participatory mapping. Now, we got very, very excited in it was in a village called Kistagiri, which is in Mahbubnagar in Andhra Pradesh. Right. We did the second PRA, where we stayed for 3 or 4 nights in the village. We did the second one there. And Sam Joseph was the key person. And they made the first social map. I mean, in this tradition, the first social map. You know, and we were over the moon. I mean, it was extraordinary. But was that the first social map ever made in the world? Oh, I doubt it. No. I really doubt it. Maybe you see, not, and then since then, I've discovered, and I met a wonderful woman in Jamaica, and she'd had people mapping. She'd done participatory mapping. She had young men in Kingston, Jamaica, making maps of where the refuse went and how the refuse should be dealt with. This is in the 70s, you see, way back. And then she took it to her boss and said, here's this map. And her boss said, go and make a proper one. You know, which happened. And then in Madras, as it was, there was, I think, World Vision. I'm not sure I think it was World Vision. They had participatory mapping going before all this, you see. But it didn't take off. And I think this was the moment, it was a sort of flash moment when there was enough disquiet with what was going on. There was enough searching for some other way of going about local development, going about participation. It was a moment that was ready for PRA as it emerged here. You will find handwritten one side called mapping, and it said, if you want to facilitate mapping, here's some tips. And there was another one for transect, and there was another, but they were all handwritten. And that was quite deliberate. It was to keep it loose and informal, and not to fit it into a mold so that, you know, you've got to do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, but just to keep it loose. And then Marada started writing about this. They had a series which they called it PALM, Participatory Learning and Management or something, PALM. I forget what it stood for, but they produced a series of this. You know, issue 1, issue 2, issue 3. So that may have been some of the very first stuff that was written. Well, you see, this is part of the injustice of attribution, which is one of the most unfortunate things in our world. And that is that people like me, who've got the time and the resources and the freedom to go around and to learn from other people and then to write about it, are then thought of to be the authors of the whole thing, you know, as though because I was the person who had the time to write, I had the access through IDS. IDS would publish what I wrote. Other people didn't have that. Jimmy wrote, but he was very, very busy. And other people wrote, Parmish and others, they wrote. But they were very, very busy and they didn't have the same opportunity and access. And so someone from the north, like me, gets credited. I don't mind being blamed, but I get credited with having been far more involved in this thing than I really was. I was going around and I was going around to what other people were doing, and my jaw was dropping with amazement at what was happening. And I was scribbling away, and taking photographs all the time. And then I showed these photographs around, and some of them got published, one thing and another. So people thought I was much more involved than I was. I'll answer the one about I'll answer the one about how it happened. My perception of how it happened, and there'll be different perceptions. But you have to go back a bit. You have to go back really to the 70s and the 80s. And you have to go back to the pathology of questionnaire surveys. And we used to talk about survey slavery. Once you had a questionnaire, everyone would add questions. It would get longer and longer and longer. Then you'd have these poor enumerators or investigators, whatever they were called, who would be trained, and there would be pilot tests, and they would go out with a questionnaire which people would have to take 3 hours to answer. It happened again. It still happens. It's terrible, but it still happens. And what comes out of it? A huge amount of information, 3/4 of which is rubbish. Well, I exaggerate, half of which is rubbish. and hardly any of which is ever going to be used, an awful lot of which never gets processed. Now that's better because we have computers, okay, but so it's speeded up. But there was that pathology. That was one of the problems that was really, really hitting people in the 70s because it was being recognized, and in the early 80s. And the other problem was the brief rural visit, which we're all vulnerable to. We've all done it. We used to call it, still do call it, rural development tourism, because you go and you meet we've just done it in Nainital. Mm-hmm. You go and you meet the Pradhan, and the Pradhan makes a speech about we need water, we need a road, with blah blah, and you sit at the table and there are flowers, and someone brings you some tea or Coca-Cola or something. No.
Because we crossed two rivers and
no, ours was better. I know. But the point is that yes, but then you go to selected places which are suitable or considered suitable by authorities, right? And there are all these biases of perception built into rural visits. So there were these two problems. So the question was, how do you overcome these? And one of the responses to this was what was called RRA, Rapid Rural Appraisal, which was a thing of the 80s, particularly of the 80s, which was saying, well, we've got to offset all those biases of the visit. We've got to make sure that we meet poorer people. We use semi-structured interviews systematically. We do transects. There were a whole repertoire of methods which were used and which people were trained in. And the sort of consummation of this, the high point of this, was an international conference in 1985 in the University of Khon Kaen in Thailand, where the people who were practicing this all came together. And it was clear that something very important had happened. Agroecosystem analysis was part of this, which Gordon Conway and his colleagues in the University of Chiang Mai in the late 70s and early 80s, they had developed this. And this had the diagramming. So there was the diagramming was there, but who made the diagrams? Who made the maps? We did. Only we know how to make maps. Only we can do diagrams, you see. So that was the belief, and that was the second half of the 80s. And then there were some scales from the eyes experiences. I can only tell you about my own experiences, but there were many other pathways. There's a tendency, if you're talking about your own experience, it looks as though that's causal. And it's really important to recognize that this is not the case, or it may be a bit, but that there are lots of other flows and causes which keep on coming together. It's like a braided stream. But I can tell you three scales from the eyes experiences that I had. One was in Ethiopia. A small hut. It was an RRA training in rural Ethiopia, Desi. small hut, 2 Ethiopians who were doing the training, and 3 farmers sitting there. Really quite small, and a table. And in those days, we used to have a system of asking people which was more and which was less. So they asked these farmers, well, let's talk about agricultural labor by month. What are your months? They got the months out. And then which month do you have most work? And which do you have least work? And then which is the next most, and so on. So you build up a histogram, a bar diagram, which represents an interpretation by us of what they have said. And then there was this idea. They asked the farmers, they said, look, this is what we've drawn. What do you make of this? And the farmers looked at it and they said, yeah, you've drawn what we said. And you won't believe this, but before that, we didn't think that people like these farmers, not literate, that they could understand a bar diagram. Now, the next scales from the eyes was in West Bengal. And this was more dramatic. It was with scientists, agricultural scientists, and we were in the field, and we went to a tribal village. And we had the same discussion with them. But we thought, let's ask them if they can make this diagram on the ground. And bloody hell, they did. They made a histogram on the ground, and I think they used rice powder to outline it nicely. The men did it. And then we asked the women, well, your labor may be different. So the men had done theirs here, so the women did theirs here. And then the women started arguing among themselves. I thought, what the hell's going on here? And then the women went and they put a huge block on the bottom of their diagram, because they said, look, you've asked us about our agricultural work, so we've shown you our agricultural work. But you know what else we do? We cook, we clean, we fetch the water, all the things which women did. So we're going to have this great big block. And their block, of course, then was much bigger than the men's. I thought, bloody hell, well then what else can they do? And this was one of the lines which fed into the PRA thing, because it was clear something was waiting to happen, you see. But I tell this because these were my experiences, but other people were having similar experiences. These things happen in parallel, you see. Well, then what happened then was that I had this incredible privilege of being at ASCI, the Administrative Staff College of India, in Hyderabad. I was there. I was funded. I was there for 2 years. I had 2 years there, and they didn't know what I was there for or what I was going to do. So I was legitimate and free. It was fantastic because there were people who were innovating at that time, particularly in South India, but also in Gujarat. That was with the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, who were one of the people who funded me, and they were innovating, and so the next scales for the eyes that I'll tell you.
But which year was this?
This was 1989, second half of 89.
This is West Bengal. And
no, the West Bengal was 88 or early 89.
88 and early 89, and you moved to ASCI in 18.
In the middle, yeah.
In the middle.
And actually, I was meant to be working on agricultural research and extension, but I didn't. There was no log frame, thank God. So I was free, and then there was Marada, based in Bangalore, and there were other people. There was Sam Joseph. There were other people around who were innovating, and Jimmy Mascarenas was an absolutely key figure. Jimmy in Marada, and the first thing that we called PRA, Participatory Rural Appraisal. The name had already emerged a bit in East Africa and also in India. The first time we did what we called a PRA exercise in a community, we stayed there and slept there for four days, It was called Kalmandagi in Karnataka. And this was just amazing. Jimmy, who was a wonderful innovator, I mean, it owes more to him perhaps than to anybody else. Jimmy had invited two artists to draw maps. And I mean, it's, you kill yourself now with hindsight. There were these two artists, and we were camped on top of a hill where there was a temple, and the village was below. And I can still remember these two artists standing there. They were standing there, drawing their sort of pretty pictures of the village. But what did the villagers do? It was mind-blowing. There was an ordinary piece of grass next to the temple, and we said to them, do you think you could make a model of the land around here and of the village? And they dug it up, and there was all the earth, and it just, I thought, this is ridiculous. They can't possibly turn this bit of grass into a model. And then I went away and did some other thing. And when I came back, it was incredible. They had made a physical model which included the hill and the temple. They had coloured the different land uses with different colours of Rangoli powder. The whole thing was spectacularly beautiful because of the colours. They had put in sticks and little wires for the electricity which had just been delivered to the village. They had the roads. They had the houses. There was this fabulous model, and I mean, it completely in an Indian tradition of colours, the things that holy and all the rest of it, and also of making models of things. And one of the farmers said, "Do you know?" He said, "I've been wanting to do this all my life."
Really?
Yes. And, I couldn't believe it, because I mean, I had always had this bit of this, not always, but later I did, around this time, I'd had this ideology: people can do more than we think they can do. But I had no inkling that they could do something as spectacular as this. And then after this, we really didn't look back, because, people like Jimmy, there were Jimmy, there was Parmesh Shah, there was Anil Shah, there was Meera Shah. Those last three were all with the Aga Khan Rural Support Program. Sam Joseph, who was with Action Aid, Shilu Francis, there was Devavaram was another one. There were and then there were also people in government as well who came in, and that was another really, really important thing. They became a community, a small community. Aloysius Fernandez, who was the head of Marada, and some other people. And it became a very excited community of people. Kamal Kar became involved when we did a training in Bihar in the middle of the monsoon, as I think I told you. And so the people heard about this, and they came because they thought there was something exciting. And quite a lot of these people never look back. Look at what Kamal Kar has done. Neela Mukherjee is another one.
Yeah,
I mean, Neela has. I mean, it's amazing. She's written 4 or 5 books about this, and she's done enormous numbers of trainings. And Parmesh Shah went on to be the participation person in the World Bank. Anil Shah was a wonderful facilitator, retired IAS officer, ex-secretary Rural Development and everything. His facilitation was just fabulous. I mean, I've seen him. I saw him on one occasion with women in Gujarat, and they were almost completely covered. In fact, I think they were completely covered when he started. And he managed to talk and to joke and to ask them, and gradually they uncovered, and then they were all so animated. I had a whole series of photographs of this, because I was just standing there flabbergasted at the way in which this man could bring people out. And he was also a wonderful innovator, which is, as you know, has been a part of PRA. This idea that you improvise and innovate as you go along. And he was fabulous at that. And I've seen him with groups of people, enabling them to do forms of analysis that you wouldn't have expected. I mean, like people like Pradhan Sarpanchs, whatever they call them in Gujarat, a whole group of them, he would ask them, what are the qualities of a good Sarpanch? You know? And they would list these qualities, and then, how do you rank yourself? This sort of thing. And he would get people to do this. And absolutely amazing. So it was an extraordinarily exciting time, because there were these Indian innovators who were continually inventing things. And so, we got involved, and we used to go around, different people went around doing workshops, showing slides, telling stories, and then NGOs got very interested, and government got interested. So that was kind of when it took off. Many of the people who criticised PRA either had no field experience of it, or had tried it and done it badly. There were people who criticised PRA because they said, look, if you have a meeting of a whole community, you only certain people will speak. The women will be marginalised. As though all these people who were involved in PRA were so bloody stupid and so ignorant and so naive that they would imagine that you got empowerment, or you got reality out of having a large village meeting. Because the people who are making these criticisms, their experience had been, they'd been to a large village meeting, they'd made the mistake, and they were blaming PRA for it. I mean, I'm being a little bit, I know the people concerned, and I'm being a little bit hard on them with that criticism, and they're good people. But I think this goes for participation generally, and for different modes of participation, that you need the field grounding of the experience personally. And we've seen this with CLTS. Look at the last few days. The way in which it has been transformative in terms of the understanding and realization of people who had not experienced CLTS triggering before.